Okay, we have two people that do not have cameras on. So if you wouldn't mind, David and Allie, if you wouldn't mind turning your cameras on. And I am all set. So everybody is assigned to groups. We should be all set to go.
Wonderful. All right, so I will be narrating, and Chris will be reading the portion of the European in this exercise. Sage and Zoe from UConn NACP will be our scroll readers. So the squares on your screen represent a place known to some Indigenous peoples as Turtle Island, specifically the part that we now call the United States. And you represent the Indigenous peoples who lived here prior to European contact. You and your ancestors have lived on Turtle Island for tens of thousands of years. You are one with the land you live upon. All of your needs, food, clothing, shelter, culture, are provided by the land, which is represented here by the squares on your screen. You are deeply identified with the place that the Creator gave you to live, and you honor the earth as your mother, the source of all that sustains you. Each part of your daily life is imbued with responsibility to care for her. Across Turtle Island, there are hundreds of nations, each with its own language, culture, traditions, and systems of subsistence. As communities, you interact and trade with one another. You have ways of ending disputes which arise. And while there is great and exquisite diversity among the various tribes, each understands they come from the same mother and therefore are of the same family. Sage, will you read scroll 1?
So Kateri, a Mohawk youth, says, quote, "One of my favorite things about my culture is how we're taught that everything on the earth is to be respected. It's an important part of the culture and covers everything. That includes respecting yourself. Respecting yourself is one of the most important things my culture has taught me. Also, the land, water, plants, air, and animals are all very important to our culture and need to be respected. Without any of it, what would we be?"
In the 15th century, events occurring in Europe were setting the stage for settler colonialism to deeply impact remaining Indigenous societies around the world. Your life here is about to be interrupted.
Without consulting you, we made deals amongst ourselves and divided up control over you and your lands. Usually, whichever nation discovered your land first took control with the blessing of the Christian Church. This practice is now called the doctrine of discovery.
Zoe, will you read scroll 2?
On October 12, 1492, Christopher Columbus first sighted shore. Men and women, full of wonder, emerged from their villages onto the beaches and swam out to get a closer look at their 3 boats. When Columbus and his men came ashore, more people ran to greet them, bringing gifts.
From the Journal of Christopher Columbus, quote, "They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know of them, for I showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want."
Europeans landing in the New World repeatedly reported how remarkable the people of this land were for their hospitality and their belief in sharing. This trait of generosity, however, did not stand out in many of the Europeans themselves. Fleeing domination and persecution under the rule of brutal monarchs, many arrived in a frenzy for land ownership, riches, and power over others to escape oppression, as did Christopher Columbus.
Greatly exaggerating the riches he had found in the so-called New World, Columbus concluded his first report to the King and Queen of Spain by asking for more help from their majesties. promising in return to bring from his next voyage, quote, as much gold as they needed and as many slaves as they asked, unquote. Because of Columbus's promises, his second expedition was given 17 ships with more than 1,200 men. Upon his second arrival, Columbus and his men went from island to island in the Caribbean, taking the people as captives and forcing them to mine gold, though there was little gold to be found.
Sage, will you read scroll 3?
Columbus had to fill the ships returning to Spain with some kind of dividend, and so he sent his men on a great slave raid. In 1495, they rounded up 1,500 Arawak, then picked 500 best specimens to load onto their ships and set sail for Spain, but too many died in captivity.
Desperate to find a way to pay back his investors, Columbus reverted to the dream of filling his ships with gold. Everyone 14 years or older was forced to collect a certain amount of gold. When they delivered it, they were given copper tokens to hang around their necks. Indians found without a copper token had their hands cut off, and they were left to bleed to death.
Because of the brutality that had invaded their lives, mass suicides began among the Arawaks. In 2 years, through murder, mutilation, or suicide, half of the 250,000 Arawak people on Haiti were dead.
Will those of you in group 4 please turn off your cameras? You represent those Arawak who died as a result of Columbus's brutalities. When it was clear there was no gold left, the Spanish forced the remaining people to work with other forms of hard labor, and they died by the thousands. By 1650, less than 200 years after Christopher Columbus arrived in America, the Arawak peoples were extinct. Those remaining, that's the end of that one.
When English settlers first arrived on the mainland of Turtle Island, you were here to greet them. These early settlers depended on you for their survival, and you helped them to understand how you did things, how you taught your children, how you took care of people who were sick, how you lived off the land in a way that left enough for future generations, and how your government worked. In the beginning, there was cooperation between you and the settlers. The settlers and their leaders recognized you as having your own governments, laws, and territories. They recognized you as independent nations. They made treaties with you. These treaties were agreements between you and the kings and queens of countries in Europe and explained how you were going to share the land. For you, the treaties were very special and sacred agreements. They were statements of peace, friendship, and sharing, and they were based on respect and honesty. Sharing was your way of life. Your hunters shared food with everyone, and families helped one another raise their children. In the treaties, you were sharing what was needed with those who had recently arrived.
For example, Article 3 of the Northwest Ordinance Act of 1787 stated, "The utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. Their lands and their property shall never be taken from them without their consent. And in their property rights and liberty, they never shall be invaded or disturbed, unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress. But laws shall be made from preventing wrongs being done to them and for preserving peace and friendship with them." However, we Europeans come from a different life experience. In Europe, lands were owned by kings and queens who ruled over us and subjugated us to their will. Many of us arriving in your lands were escaping persecution. We were seeking riches to improve our lives. Our visions of power, free land to claim, and religious conversion conflicted sharply with your cultures.
Zoe, will you read scroll 4?
In line with the thinking of the Doctrine of Discovery, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Withrow, believed that he could take land from the Indians by declaring the area legally a vacuum. The Indians, he said, had not subdued the land and therefore only had a natural right. And in his mind, a natural right did not have legal standing.
At this point, I would like you to imagine that the blankets that you are standing on are slowly being folded back at the edges. and imagine yourselves moving closer and closer together in order to stay on the blankets. Colonists felt entitled to claim your lands. After many broken treaties, you realized they were using treaties not as a way of agreeing to share territory, but as a means to set you up to lose all rights to your homelands. You came to realize that their most solemn pledge would be broken whenever their obligation to you conflicted with gaining advantage and more territory. Your population and territory were being rapidly diminished by their merciless ways of war. Your weapons were unequal to their weapons, and all acts to defend your homelands were met with brutal retaliation and punishment. Sage, will you read scroll 5?
Wahansanakawa, chief of Sinakomaka, says, quote, "The colony of Jamestown was founded inside our territory. We watched the English settle and did not attack or defend. When the English were going through their starving time in the winter of 1610, some of their people fled to join us and we took them in. Summer came and the governor of the colony sent a messenger to ask me to return all who had run away. When I did not enforce his request, soldiers were sent to avenge our people. Our village and crops were burned. Many of us were killed and kidnapped. Those of us who remained were forced to retreat into hiding, no longer able to live in peace and enjoyment of life. From a distance, we watched growing numbers of English arriving in the increase of settlements for many years. Because of the treatment of our people and land, we organized to wipe out those we had once welcomed. We managed to kill over 300 men, women, and children, but did not succeed in fully wiping them out. From then on, it was total war between us."
Edmund Morgan from American Slavery, American Freedom. Since the Indians were better woodsmen than the English and virtually impossible to track down, the method was to feign peaceful intentions, let the Indians settle down and plant their corn where they chose, and then just before harvest fall upon them, killing as many as possible and burning the corn. Within 2 or 3 years of the Indigenous-led massacre of Jamestown, the English had avenged the deaths of that day many times over.
Those of you in group 5, you represent those nations on the East Coast who did not survive during your stand to defend your families and homeland. Please turn off your cameras. Before long, there were more Europeans living along the east coast of Turtle Island than the original peoples. One reason for this was the diseases the Europeans brought with them, diseases such as smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis. You, the indigenous people, suffered badly from these diseases because you had never had them in your communities before. Millions of you died. Some people believe that half the indigenous people alive at the time died from these diseases. In some communities, 9 out of 10 people died.
In some places, blankets infected with the deadly smallpox virus were given or traded to the indigenous people by settlers and supported by military leaders such as Lord Geoffrey Amherst, Britain's Commander-in-Chief, North America, and Colonel Henry Bouquet. Those of you in Group 6, you represent the many indigenous people who died from smallpox after having come in contact with such blankets. Please turn off your camera.
We will observe a moment of silence for this moment in remembrance of those who died from these diseases.
So we also want to ask those of you in Group 1, all of you with Group 1, please turn off your cameras. You represent the millions of people who died from the various diseases across the country. Some of you represent the First Nations that were divided when the border between the United States and British Canada was created. This border divides your community and cuts you off from each other.
In 1776, at the time the 13 English colonies acquired independence from Britain, they had a population of nearly 4 million, most of whom lived within 50 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. Their Indian Trade and Intercourse Act, repassed by Congress in 1802, said there could be no land cessions except by treaty between the federal government and the tribes. In other words, there could be no relinquishment of rights, property, or territory except by treaty. Of course, Indian territories would always be under federal law. However, the thinking behind the doctrine of discovery was not fully embedded in this. However, the thinking behind the doctrine of discovery was fully embedded in this new government. The United States increasingly viewed you not as sovereign nations, but as obstacles to further expansion and settlement, and soon declared all Native people to be enemies of the state.
President Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United Colonies, appointed a young Andrew Jackson to appropriate Creek and Cherokee lands for the purpose of expansion. Jackson's full-on warfare against you opened up much of the southeast continent to settlers' claim. Those of you in Group 7, you represent those Creek and Cherokee whose land were appropriated for settler expansion. You were forced to leave your territories. Please turn off your camera.
Jackson's success in clearing the lands of the original peoples made him the most popular candidate for presidency in the United States in 1829. Once elected, Andrew Jackson was in a position to carry out his plan of removing all Indians east of the Mississippi. He quickly signed a law he had proposed, the Indian Removal Act. It overrode the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act and legalized his vision of Indian removal. Zoe, will you read scroll 6?
As soon as Andrew Jackson became president, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi immediately passed laws to extend their state rule over the Indians in their territory. New laws did away with the tribe as a legal unit, outlawing tribal meetings, removing the chief's powers, and making the Indians subject to militia duty and state taxes while denying them the right to vote, to bring suit, or to testify in court. State lotteries redistributed areas that had been designated as indigenous land, and white settlers were encouraged to move in.
President Jackson made promises to the eastern tribes of financial support and land beyond the Mississippi to persuade them to move west voluntarily, sending an army major to talk to the Choctaws and Cherokees with this instruction: "Say to my red Choctaw children and my Chickasaw children, I am their friend. But they must remove themselves from the states of Mississippi and Alabama to be settled in the lands west of the Mississippi River. There they will possess land of their own for as long as the grass grows or water runs. I am and will protect them and be their friend and father."
Sage, will you read scroll 7?
To this, the Cherokee Nation replied, "We wish to remain on the land of our fathers. We have a perfect and original right to remain without interruption or molestation. The treaties with us and laws of the United States made in pursuance of treaties guarantee our residence and our privileges and secure us against intruders. Our only request is that these treaties may be fulfilled and these laws executed."
President Jackson ignored all legal negotiations the Cherokee Nation was making with Congress to maintain their homelands, and chose to enact their forced relocation in 1837. This forced removal is known as the Trail of Tears. Zoe, will you read scroll 8?
Under orders, this is by journalist James Mooney, 1838. Under orders, U.S. troops were disposed at various points throughout Cherokee country, where stockade forts were erected for gathering in and holding the Indians preparatory to removal. Squads were sent out to search, seize, and bring in as prisoners all the occupants. Families at dinner were startled by the sudden gleam of bayonets in the doorway and rose up to be driven with blows to the stockade. Men were seized in their fields, women were taken from their wheels, and children from their play. In many cases, on turning for one last look as they crossed the ridge, they saw their homes in flames.
Half half of the 16,000 Cherokee men, women, and children who were forcibly marched in the dead of winter perished on the journey from their homelands, which were in the area we call Georgia and Alabama. Survivors of the march were left to begin anew in what was designated as Indian Territory, currently Oklahoma. Following the removal of the Cherokee Nation, one by one, tribes from the south all the way to the north were forced to march west over the Appalachian Mountains. Within 7 years, 46,000 of you were removed from your homelands east of the Mississippi. Your removal opened 25 million acres of land to white settlement.
Those of you in group 2, please turn off your cameras. You represent those who did not survive the forced removal from your homelands.
Let us observe a moment of silence to honor those who did not survive the forced marches, as well as those who arrived in unfamiliar territory, heartsick and starving, and those who managed to escape the roundups, who were left behind in isolated places of hiding.
During the next 50 years, European settlers claimed your vacated lands. More than 4 million settlers also crossed the Appalachians behind you in one of the largest and most rapid migrations in history. Jackson's promise to you to provide lands west of the Mississippi for as long as the grass grows or water runs was not honored.
While the English were busy opening and claiming more and more lands from the east, the Spanish conquistadors had moved on from the Caribbean to conquer and claim Central America. From Central America, they made their way north into your territories, arriving in 1540. Over the next 60 years, the Spanish established permanent settlements in your homelands, treating you with similarly brutal techniques as Columbus had used against the Arawaks. After enduring terrible mistreatment by the Spanish for nearly a century, you fought furiously to defend your homelands. In the Pueblo Uprising of 1869, your tribes united in warfare and killed 400 Spanish settlers and 21 Franciscan missionaries. Your warriors then drove out the remaining 2,000 Spanish settlers. 12 years later, the conquistadors returned from Mexico with renewed intention and force. They successfully expanded their empire north and west, invading the lands of hundreds of tribes, torturing, enslaving, and killing as they claimed new territory for Spain and building missions up the Pacific coast.
Those of you in group 8, you represent those nations who are living on the Southwest. Many of you experienced extreme violence at the hands of the conquistadors and died as a result. Please turn off your camera.
Please pause for a moment of silence in respect for those who were tortured, enslaved, or lost their lives under the rule of Spanish settlers.
When the Spanish moved into your territories during the 1700s, your population was estimated at around 275,000 people. By the 1800s, some of the English settlers had also made their way onto your territories. In January of 1848, a millwright named James Marshall discovered gold along the American River. This discovery prompted the largest migration in the history of the Western Hemisphere. The number of European settlers rose from about 10,000 people to more than 220,000 in 2 years. Most of the gold rushers were men, their average age being 22 years old.
Their presence proved disastrous for all of you. Miners entered your villages, raped your women, and killed your men. Instances were cited of miners who went on killing sprees, murdering 50 or more of you in a day. Those of you who survived these attacks scattered, afraid to return to your homelands. Within 50 years of the discovery of gold, less than 20% of your population remained. Please pause for a moment of silence for the Native people who lost their lives during the California Gold Rush. For several millennia, you and the buffalo prospered on the Great Plains in a relationship of deep respect. The buffalo were central to every part of your life and spiritual existence. Following the Civil War, the federal government acquired millions of acres of your traditional hunting ground to make way for the Iron Horse, and in 1869, the first transcontinental railway was completed. The railroads opened up the interior regions of the continent, creating access for war against your tribes to begin.
The first attempts by the U.S. Army to drive you off the plains and into reservations were unsuccessful. You were skillful at eluding the Army. Incapable of rounding you up, Army officers reverted to the war tactic of eradicating your food sources. Knowing if the buffalo were extinct, you of the Great Plains would have to surrender to the reservation system. Colonel Dodge inspired mass killing of the buffalo with his words, "Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." As more white infantry and settlers moved across the plains, the Great Sioux Nation was forced to retreat deep into the Black Hills.
Those of you in Group 9, you represent those members of the Sioux Nation who are forced to retreat to the Black Hills, and some of you died during this retreat. Please turn off your camera. Now is when a great folding back of the blankets would normally occur, leaving only a patchwork of small, crumpled pieces of blanket here and there. Then gold was discovered in the Black Hills, and 100,000 prospectors rushed in to seek their fortune. To protect the gold and the prospectors, the federal government decided to clear the Black Hills of all remaining Lakota. On a reconnaissance mission in June of 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer stumbled across one of your camps near the Little Bighorn River. With 700 soldiers, Custer charged your camp of 7,000. Within 3 hours, you killed Custer's entire regiment.
In response to your victory, more U.S. soldiers moved in and forced 3,000 of your warriors onto reservations where they were held, dependent on Indian agents for their existence. Those of you not taken onto reservations scattered in small bands and struggled to survive.
Sage, will you read Scroll 9?
Leonard Crow Dog, Sioux Nation, quote, "Only when we saw them building roads through our land, wagons at first, and then the railroad, when we watched them building forts, killing off all the game, committing buffalo genocide, and we saw them ripping up our Black Hills for gold, our sacred Pahasapa, the home of the Wahansinakawa, the Thunderbirds. Only then did we realize that what they wanted was our land. Then we began to fight for our earth, for our children. That started what the whites call the Great Indian Wars of the West. I call it the Great Indian Holocaust."
In December of 1890, Chief Bigfoot led the last band of independent Sioux south to seek protection at the Pine Ridge Reservation. The Army intercepted them and brought them to the banks of Wounded Knee Creek. In the morning, tensions set off gunfire, and within minutes, approximately 300 Sioux warriors, women, and children were massacred. Wounded Knee was the final breaking of the Great Sioux Nation, and then marked the end of the Plains Indian Wars in the north. Zoe, will you read Scroll 10?
Black Elk was one of the 27 Sioux who survived the massacre at Wounded Knee later in his life. He said, "When I look back now, I still see the butchered women and children heaped and scattered as plain as I saw them with eyes still young. And I see that something else died there. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream."
Those of you in Group 10, you represent the Plains and West Coast Native people who died in battle, in massacres, and from starvation as your food sources and ecosystems were destroyed. Please turn off your camera.
Over the years, the United States government had signed and broken over 400 treaties with Native people. Eventually, Congress no longer recognized Indigenous tribes as independent nations with whom treaties could be signed. Over the years, settlers of conscience did speak out against the genocide. In 1830, 1 million Americans out of a total population of 13 million petitioned against President Jackson's Indian Removal Act. However, the doctrine of discovery was embedded in the US legal system, and Congress passed the Indian Removal Act despite mass protests.
In 1923, the Supreme Court again ruled that Christian people had the right to discover and possess the land of heathens, and that the United States had, quote unquote, ultimate title over all lands within its boundaries. Indigenous people had a mere, quote unquote, right of occupancy. The doctrine of discovery has been cited by the US Supreme Court as recently as 2005 in City of Sherrill, New York versus Oneida Nation. Quote, under the doctrine of discovery, fee title or ownership to the lands occupied by Indians when the colonists arrived became vested in the sovereign, first the discovering European nation and later the original states and the United States, end quote.
In 1900, your population was down to 250,000 people, less than 1% of the US population. Most of you were living on government reservations without access to your homelands. You had been diminished from being people of strong independent nations to isolated and poor tribes that depended on the government for almost everything. The Bureau of Indian Affairs treated you like you knew nothing and as though you were incapable of running your own lives. Your homeland is now restricted to this parcel of government that the government has reserved for you. Your hunting grounds no longer exist. You are not considered citizens and you may not vote. You are allowed your own government, but the US government enforces restriction on all you do. You are free only to remain living on a managed, government-controlled reservation or leave the reservation to take up the ways of the white man.
Sage, will you read scroll 11?
So this is historian S.C. Gwynn. The difficulties and losses suffered in relocation to reservations were the source of disease, alcoholism, and deep despair in those left to live on them. One of the confined Comanche of the Southern Plains said, quote, the reservation was a shattering experience. The system was both cruel and humiliating. The whites had taken away everything that had defined Comanche existence and offered nothing but crude squalor in its place. From the moment the people arrived, there was only a great yawning void of hunger and desperation and dependency. There was no way out and no way back.
Soon after being forced onto reservations, Congress passed the Dawes Act, which forced you to break up your communal societies on the reservations by dividing all tribal lands into small parcels for individual ownership. The Dawes Act functioned as a legal tool for the white population to gain ownership of reservation lands. Over the next 40 years, you lost over 90 million acres, nearly 2/3 of the original reservation land allotted by the US government. Zoe, will you read scroll 12?
Walter Echohawk, notable Pawnee attorney from the Native American Rights Fund, said, the law has been employed as a sword to harm Native peoples by stripping away their human rights, appropriating their property, stamping out their cultures, and to provide legal justification for the federal policies that have, at times, resorted to genocide and ethnocide.
Next, the US government turned toward assimilating you into mainstream American society. The education, quote unquote, of your children in boarding schools away from the influence of the tribe was considered an essential part of the civilizing process being imposed. In 1879, Captain Richard Henry Pratt founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania by removing 84 Lakota children from their families in the Dakotas. His principle, quote, kill the Indian and save the man, unquote, became a model for a new government policy of assimilation through education. By the year 1900, thousands of children were attending close to 150 boarding schools throughout the United States. The school's purpose was to strip children of their culture and remove them from the influence of their family and tribe. Those of you in group 3, You represent the children who were taken from your communities and placed in one of the Indian schools too far away for your parents to visit. Upon entering boarding school, everything you had from your home is taken from you. Your hair is cut off, you're scrubbed down and given white man's clothes and an English name. Punishment rains down whenever you are heard speaking your own language. You are made to suffer emotional, physical, and/or sexual abuse. Some of you will die while far from your families. Sage, will you read scroll 13?
In the 1960s, a congressional report found that many teachers in the Indian schools still saw their role as civilizing American Indian students, not educating them. The report said the schools still had a, quote, major emphasis on discipline and punishment. The number of Native American children in the boarding schools reached a peak in the United States in the 1970s with an estimated enrollment of 60,000.
Thousands of children died at the schools or who died later as a result of their experience. Many of you were welcomed back when you returned from boarding school, but found it difficult to fit in with life at home. Some of you experienced lateral violence when you returned. The result was family ties that were damaged because of intergenerational disruption. Those of you in group 9, you represent those whose connection to your family and community was completely broken by your experience in boarding school. You never made it home. You may keep your cameras on, however, we will all take a moment of silence in honor of these generations.
Zoe, will you read scroll 14?
Oglala Sioux Chief Luther Standing Bear says, regarding the civilization that has been thrust upon me since the days of the reservation, it has not added one whit of my sense of justice. To my reverence for the rights of life, to my love for the truth, honesty, and generosity, nor to my faith in the Wakan, Tanaka, God of the Lakotas. So if today I had a young mind to direct to start on the journey of life, and I was faced with the duty of choosing between the natural way of my ancestors and that of the white man's present way of civilization, I would set that child's foot in the path of my ancestors. I would raise him to be an Indian.
After creating dependency through the reservation system, in the 1950s, Congress decided to terminate federal recognition and assistance to more than 100 Native tribes. The new termination laws created economic disaster for these tribes, resulting in extreme poverty and millions of acres of land being lost through tax forfeiture sale. Now, federal policy encouraged Native people to move from their shrinking reservations and the last vestiges of their communal life to make it on their own in the cities. Today, almost 80% of America's Native people live outside of the reservations.
I would like to ask all of our participants, both on camera and off, to take a look at your screen and remember what it looked like at the beginning of our session. All surviving Native American people suffer from the intergenerational effect of genocide, displacement, and forced assimilation. The remaining population is currently dying of diabetes, alcoholism, tuberculosis, suicide, and other health conditions at shocking rates. They suffer disproportionate rates of disease, rape, and domestic violence compared with all other Americans. Despite colonization, many have survived. Native American leaders actively work for the recovery of their people and culture, and in recent years, tribes have won significant victories in the courts of Congress. Sage, will you read scroll 15?
Beginning in 1987, Native Americans worked with Indigenous peoples from around the world for more than 20 years to create the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This declaration affirms the individual and collective human rights of Indigenous peoples. It spells out what self-determination means, that Indigenous societies have the right to self-governance, to education in their own languages, to full expression of their religions and cultures, to defend their lands and territories, and to make use of their natural resources for economic development.
When the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples came to a vote in the General Assembly in 2007, 144 countries voted in favor. Under the Bush administration, the United States was one of only 4 countries to oppose it. President Obama eventually endorsed the UN Declaration with some qualifications.
In 2009, Congress passed the Apology to Native Peoples of the United States, saying, "The United States, acting through Congress, recognizes that there have been years of official depredations, ill-conceived policies, and the breaking of covenants by the federal government against Indian tribes. Apologizes on behalf of the people of the United States to all Native peoples for the many instances of violence, maltreatment, and neglect inflicted upon Native peoples by the citizens of the United States, and urges the President to acknowledge the wrongs of the United States against Indian tribes in the history of the United States in order to bring healing to this land." President Obama acknowledged the importance of the apology, saying, "It's a resolution I fully support, recognizing that no statement can undo the damage that was done. What it can do is help reaffirm the principles that should guide our future. It's only by heeding the lessons of our history that we can move forward."
Zoe, will you read scroll 16?
Oren Leon's Seneca Faithkeeper, 1992, addressed the United Nations and said, "Even though you and I are in different boats, you in your boat and we in our canoe, we share the same river of life. What befalls me befalls you. And downstream in this river of life, our children will pay for our selfishness, for our greed, and for our lack of vision. 500 years ago, you came to our pristine lands of great forests, rolling plains, crystal clear lakes, and streams and rivers, and we have suffered in your quest for God, for glory, for gold. But we have survived. We can still alter our course. It is not too late. We still have options. We need the courage to change our values to the regeneration of our families and the life that surrounds us."
I will now share the words of Rio Ramirez, a young man from the Tohono O'odham Nation, when he addressed a group like this one. Quote, "Knowing this country's history is the first step we need to take in the long process of repairing our people and our land. Look at the problems our people have now with things like substance abuse, lack of identity, and diabetes. Look at the crisis the earth is in with climate change and pollution. Our history tells us how this came about. Sometimes when people learn about the broken treaties, relocation, and genocide, they feel guilty about what happened to Native Americans. Those feelings are okay as long as we move past them and try to help each other now as human beings. No one here today made these things happen, but we are the ones who are living now, and we need to understand that we are all in this together." End quote.